So like I said, this is really the brainchild of our very own Evelyn Berryhill, so I'll let her introduce our topic for tonight.
So we're going to talk about how to speak English and what that means. So we're going to talk about English as a language and the people who speak it. And Katie, if you want to go to the next slide.
There we go.
We'll also talk about standard English, what exactly that is, what it means, and how it's used. And we'll also talk about how identity of a speaker influences the way that person is viewed. So there are a lot of different things outside of just language and language use that impact how a person is viewed in society and by others. But there is a lot of interaction with language. So we'll start there.
Good starting point.
So we wanted to ask all of you a few questions first. So where do you think the most unaccented form of English is spoken in the USA?
Supposedly here in the Midwest, I've heard.
Yeah, me too. The upper Midwest.
My husband was originally in broadcasting, and when he took the course way back when, it was he was told that southern Minnesota had the least accent. But I say we all have an accent. It's just different.
That is a great answer, Nancy. And you're all right. By and large, people think that the most unaccented form of English is spoken somewhere in the Midwest. And then along with that, broadening it out, what are some types of English that you've heard of? So right now, when we're talking about English spoken in the United States, that's one type of English. Are there other types that you've heard of?
I mean, British English is very different.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce it, but AAVE, the African American Vernacular English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another language variety. Great.
And when I was in college in the 70s, I don't think it's the same thing, but it was called Ebonics, which was African language. And I think it's probably a totally different dialect than what they refer to now as AAVE.
Yeah, we're actually going to be talking about that. African American English Ebonics later in this presentation. So those are all great.
I had an employee who would come in every day and put on my whiteboard a word in Ebonics to teach me. So I would learn one word every day.
I love that. So English language variation. When we're communicating, we can understand each other because we speak the same language, which is English. But as you've all started to point out already, English is very general. And looking around the world, we can hear, and in the US, we can hear differences in pronunciation. We can see visually differences in spelling of words. And we can identify different words and phrases that have either the same or different meanings depending on factors like location and social identity. So these little tomatoes here, use them to bring up the point that there's tomato, tomato. So English speakers use both pronunciations, but speakers in one part of the world prefer tomato, while others prefer tomato. The differences, these types of differences distinguish individual varieties of English. And that's because when we're talking about language variety, we're talking about any distinctive form of a language or linguistic expression. So by identifying varieties of English that we use here in Cedar Rapids, we can get more specific about the types of English that we're teaching our students. So first up, we already started talking about this. Lisa, you mentioned British English. So British English and American English are distinct varieties of English, large-scale varieties of English that often come up in the public sphere. American English is spoken in the United States, and it's the primary language variety that we're teaching our students at CMC. British English, on the other hand, is spoken in the UK. And one variety that you may not have heard about before is Singapore English, which is spoken in Singapore. All of these varieties because these varieties are varieties of a single language, speakers of one variety can usually understand a speaker of another variety, or at least get the basic idea. There might be some misunderstandings due to different pronunciations or different meanings of shared words, but speakers can mostly understand each other. So a little bit about the three large-scale varieties that I just mentioned. In American English, we say apartment, but in British English, you might say flat. In American English, we put the emphasis on the first syllable of laboratory, and in British English, laboratory. And in English, or a lot of different versions of English, we pronounce the R's in our words. So hardest, whereas in one pronunciation of British English, the pronunciation you would hear on the BBC, the R often becomes ah, so hottest instead of hardest. And then Singapore English, which is fun. I hadn't heard about it until very recently, but it is heavily influenced by Malay and Chinese languages. So it's English, but one way that Malay and Chinese have influenced it is that there are these things called functional particles. So they're little words essentially that you can tack on to the end of a phrase to indicate to this listener what you are doing specifically. So you can ask, you can use a functional particle on the end of your sentence, and it will tell someone if you are asking a question, if you are making a very definite assertion, or if you are uncertain, or even asking a question for clarity. So ma here is a functional particle that indicates that a question was asked for clarity or for confirmation. So Jane was the one who brought the food, ma. And I think Katie was going to mention a little something about Singapore English too.
Now I'm forgetting what it was. Oh dear. I will say though that this did kind of blow my mind. I didn't know that, first of all, until I had a cousin that studied abroad in Singapore, I didn't even know that English was a language that was spoken there. So that was really surprising to me at the time. And yeah, just getting to hear from my cousin about his experiences there and learning you know, that particular variety of English was definitely a bit of a learning curve for him, and just like adjusting to that particular variety of English that he hadn't been familiar with sounded like a pretty fascinating experience.
And I've had several students say, I know English, but I was taught English by English speakers, not Americans. And so they have a hard time making, even though they might have good vocabulary, it's the hearing the differences and how we pronounce things that throws them.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that hottest example for British English just made me chuckle, because I was just watching a couple of videos from This Old House on YouTube over the weekend, which, if you're not familiar, is a bunch of like home restoration things that these like handymen from the Northeast are doing, and they all have very thick Boston accents, and hottest was definitely something that they would say in their yeah very Massachusetts accents. So that one made me chuckle.
Okay, so moving on to dialects. The term variety also encompasses dialects, which are distinctive language forms that have their own systematic pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. So some examples of geographic-based dialects are Gulf Southern American English, which is spoken around here, and Inland Northern American English, spoken over here. So areas that we're a little more familiar with, being in Iowa. So in the Midwest, we are part of several dialect regions, the biggest of which are labeled here: North Central, Inland North, and Midland. Iowa is primarily part of the Midland dialect region, although depending on who drew the map, it can be different. The lines do shift. But quite a few dialects can be found in the Midwest and Iowa, which is the basic point. We don't all speak the same way, even though, like we were talking about in the beginning, with the most unaccented form of English being in the Midwest. The Midwest is huge, and to say that we all speak the same language is a little inaccurate, very inaccurate. So in the Midwest, we speak with defining features. For instance, we can use positive anymore. And this just means that we can use the word anymore without any negative words like not anymore to mean nowadays. So one example is, phones are so expensive anymore, meaning phones are so expensive nowadays. And then another thing that we do in the Midwest is that a majority of us use the word pop instead of soda. And we also generally consider it grammatically acceptable to say, I'm headed to the grocery store. Do you want to come with? But in other parts of the country, it's ungrammatical to use the phrase come with without an object. You can't end a sentence with in other places.
This map cracked me up, because my grandparents are from Northwest Iowa, and I always thought that they talked a little bit differently from me because they grew up in the country or because they were old or something. But it turns out that according to some of our dialect maps, they were actually just raised in a slightly different dialect area than I was.
So other dialects of American English include African American English and Valley Speak. So these dialects aren't pinned down by geographic region, like the other ones we just mentioned were. Instead, they're spoken by people who generally, but not always, belong to the same social group or share a specific social identity. So for this reason, we can call them sociolects. And in case you are wondering what they sound like, here are some videos.
It's a whole bunch of people in New York that we know from down here. And the way they be talking and stuff, they like you can't have to understand.
I don't know if you could hear that, but
Oh shoot! Here, let me share my sound. We'll try that again.
you were sharing your sound. It just wasn't very loud.
Okay.
So, I don't know.
Sound like California.
You're gonna go? Oh my God. You like him? You really do? I'm totally surprised. I do too, though.
So that's Valley Speak. But today, at Valley Speak, what originally was a sociolect has slowly started to become more of a Californian dialect, but it still is somewhere between being spoken by people of a certain socioeconomic status. So before moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit more about African American English and emphasize that it's a logical linguistic system. Some people consider African American English to be broken or lazy or uneducated English, but that's not quite the case. African American English can be considered a valid sociolect because it has consistent grammatical patterns that differ from those found in the dominant version of English, which is taught in schools. So in fact, African American English is so linguistically rich that there's debate over whether it's a separate language, like a separate large-scale variety of English, or if it's a sociolect. So right here, I'm just going to call it a sociolect because that is how I was taught it, but other people, again, might call it something else. So African American English is predictable, like I said, and it's also acquired by children in the same way that other languages are acquired by children, because its structure is so predictable. And just like you and me, speakers can distinguish between grammatical and ungrammatical forms of African American English. So just like we would think, I slipped the banana peel, period, would be ungrammatical. Speakers of African American English also have phrases that just aren't acceptable in their speech. So some examples of African American English include habitual be. So habitual be is be, the word be, and it's used in a way to indicate a habitual action. So I be in my office by 7:30 in African American English is acceptable, but in dominant American English, when it would mean I'm usually in my office by 7:30. A speaker of African American English will also use words like finna, fixina, fixna, and fitna to express an action that will occur in the immediate future. So I don't know about you, but I'm finna leave. So I don't know about you, but I'm getting ready to leave. And the last linguistic variation I want to mention is an idiolect, which is just how an individual speaks. So the words one individual uses, their pronunciations, their intonation, all of it. So what determines an idiolect is basically our hobbies and interests, our social groups, our jobs, and our life experiences. They all impact how we speak. So of course, we all have our own idiolects. Personally, I have been told that I use the word cool way too much. And I also used to pronounce, and sometimes get messed up on it. I used to pronounce the word berry as bury. My mom thinks it's because my name is Berry Hill and I got confused with the berry and the letters. But those are all features of my idiolect. Now that I've talked your ears off about types of English language variation, I wanted to focus a little bit more on what is called Standard American English, or SAE. So Standard American English, what is it? And a better question is, what isn't it? So Standard American English is a variety of American English, and it also goes by General American and Dominant American English. Standard American English is hard to describe, and in fact, no one, including the experts, can agree upon a description. We can say, though, that SAE is the type of English that's taught in schools, found in textbooks and grammar books, and used in professional communication. It's the collection of all those different rules you've learned about English, like never end a sentence with a preposition, except for come with, clearly violates that rule. and rules like when to use who versus whom. And Standard American English, you could also say, is unaccented or unstigmatized English. It's just English that does not have any overt dialectal features in it. So for the longest time, and still today, like Nancy mentioned, people consider Standard American English to be spoken by network newscasters, but also spoken in the Midwest in general. But both of those assumptions have been disproven by linguistic studies. The speech of individual news anchors can be identified as particular regional dialects. And Midwesterners, like we just talked about, use linguistic features that not all people are familiar with. So in other words, news anchors and Midwesterners have accents. And if Standard American English is meant to be unaccented, then these people aren't speaking Standard American English. And by the same logic, no one really speaks Standard American English. It's an idealized version of American English because, as we've already talked about, someone has brought up that everyone speaks with some form of accent and uses words and phrases that can be linked to specific dialects. Sometimes we follow the grammar rules set by language books like side by side, but we don't have to, and we simply don't. Sometimes when I'm teaching from side by side, I get really caught off guard by the language, and I have to explain to my student that people don't actually say things the way that the book necessarily teaches us.
So why would we bother talking about it then? And the main reason is because Standard American English is considered the correct, quote unquote, American English, even though it is kind of an idealized form that no one actually speaks, kind of a figment of our of our imagination in a way. And as we've also talked about, what seems to be standard to one group of people might not be standard to another group. So when we start thinking about language in terms of being correct or incorrect, that's when we're making judgments. And those judgments are certainly about the language itself, but they do sometimes can lead us to make assumptions about the speakers of those languages. So several different studies in linguistics and the social sciences, that's a tongue twister, linguistics and the social sciences have looked at how listeners perceive speech and speakers. So one study from 1992 looked at whether or not undergraduate students' perceptions of their instructors' language skills was affected by their perception of the instructor's ethnicity. So students listened to an audio recorded lecture while looking at a picture of the supposed instructor, which was either a Caucasian woman or a Chinese woman. And all of the lectures were actually recorded by a single Ohio-born instructor who was speaking standard American English. But students struggled to understand the lecture more when they were shown the photo of the Chinese instructor than when they were looking at the Caucasian instructor. So just one example of how this could affect our judgments. So no matter how precise our students' form is in English, they might be striving to speak Iowa English like Rona, but you know, it's possible that they will not always be seen as true speakers of English. So their ability to claim English as a language that they speak could be questioned more than white speakers. So this is really, really important to be challenging, you know, challenging your own assumptions, noticing what kind of snap judgments that you jump to, challenging any, you know, assumptions that you hear coming from people just in your life, and also the things that your student says too is important to kind of let them know some of what's going on here. So I also, this was a great comment from Ben that I just wanted to share. Interestingly, Japan has dozens of regional accents and dialects, but mass media is typically produced in the Tokyo accent. So this has led to a standard Japanese dialect, but it's actually just the Tokyo dialect. So yeah, this is not specific to English necessarily. I also just, for anybody who's come to the training about French language transfer, talking about how speaking French could influence someone as they're learning English. We actually talked about this as well, where, you know, Parisian French is kind of considered standard French, and, you know, French is spoken around the world. So there are many varieties that are just as legitimate, but they're seen as like altered in some way or not as correct sometimes. So yeah, important to be aware. So we also, especially when it comes to African American English, that's a big one that I've heard just coming up from students, like asking or saying that like this person wasn't speaking right, or I found it hard to understand them. And oftentimes that's just a matter of like telling them like, no, that's just, you know, you might have encountered a different variety of English, and it is correct and logical and has its own grammar, just like we've been talking about today. So we'd like to hear from all of you, and you can, if you prefer, you're welcome to type your answers into the chat box, or you can raise your hand or just jump in and let us know what you think. So we would like to hear from everyone in the way that you prefer. What variety or sociolect do you speak of English?
When I went to school in Indiana, I was told that I had an Iowa accent, and I said, no, it's just a Judy accent because I'm a lazy speaker. I'm aware of that. And I don't always pronounce things very distinctly. So I have a Judy sociolect. I worked with a student once, most brilliant student I ever had as an English teacher, who went on to Cornell out east to college and became a professor there. But she was very hard to understand at the time. I was had her in 6th through 8th grade. And she started working with a speech therapist in high school then. But she said that's the way her dad spoke. So I think a lot of us are influenced not necessarily by anything further than just our own house. What do we hear when we're growing up? That's how we pronounce things. And it was a very, very pronounced speech impediment that, we termed it an impediment, but it was just, she heard that, so that's how she talked. I think that's the way a lot of us are. Our sociolect is our family language.
Yeah, family can have a big influence. I'm definitely in the Midlands, so that's for certain.
It looks like a couple other of you also identify as Midland speakers.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry. This is Lisa. My automatic response was to say that I spoke, the Midlands, the Midwest English, but then I thought about a couple of, I think, our Dubuque. I grew up in Dubuque, some Dubuque-isms that I've tried to kind of excise from my vocabulary. And one is throwing R's in some words. And so we laugh because in Dubuque, and it's everyone, I've noticed, we put an R in the word wash. So it's wash. And so when I hear my parents, they're always like Washington, D.C. And so our kind of joke is that in Dubuque, you say, wash your hands in the zinc. And yeah, it's just kind of been very interesting, but I still think I speak pretty standard. But I also think, I'm sorry, I couldn't remember your name, Judy. I think I am a little bit lazy in how I speak, because I do know sometimes when I was tutoring the students, I would almost have to go back in my head and think about how the word was pronounced to make sure that I hit all the syllables and that I was teaching the correct pronunciation instead of kind of slurring it off in the end, maybe.
Exactly.
I grew up in Milwaukee area, Wisconsin, which definitely has its own style of speaking and its own words, like a drinking fountain is a bubbler. And my mom and dad grew up in Madison, and they actually spoke differently from my friends in Milwaukee. My mom called things pop, or the drink pop, and we called it soda. And my mom said wash. Mm-hmm. And that we kind of teased her about it because she washed everything. But, in Milwaukee, they washed things, which was interesting because Milwaukee and Madison and Dubuque are kind of all in that same area, and yet we all spoke a little differently. I had a friend who was from Indiana, and she did an internship in Milwaukee, and she overheard her supervisors referring to her as our Southern Belle. And she was from like the middle of Indiana, maybe. Now in Southern Indiana, they definitely do sound like they're almost from Kentucky, but Northern Indiana, I never have noticed much of an accent. So it was kind of interesting that she was referred to as Southern, I thought.
Yeah, that's funny. It's funny where the Southern and Midwestern might, where the line could be, might vary depending on who you ask.
Yeah.
I'm having a hypothesis that wash must be a mother thing because my mother says wash also. And she grew up in San Diego and Denver. I was trying to think, now what part of the country did that come from? But I'm hearing it's everywhere, but just these little pockets of wash. And nobody else in the family said that. Her mother didn't say wash. That was just something mom did, and none of us kids picked that up. That was a specifically mom thing.
I hadn't planned on it, but there's this New York Times dialect quiz that I think is a lot of fun. You answer some questions about the words that you use, and then they will pinpoint you to 3 locations on a map to the type of English you speak. And I think it's funny. They don't seem to have a lot of data for Iowa. So when I took it, they placed me around Kansas City, Missouri, just because there wasn't exactly anywhere else for them to place me. But I think it's fun. And if you'd like to try it, I put a link in the chat.
I found Kansas City seemed to talk right when I taught down there one summer.
Yeah.
It sounded like Iowa.
Yeah. It's funny. I had family in Kansas City and in Milwaukee growing up, and I never really noticed the Kansans speaking much differently than me, but the Milwaukee sound was definitely noticeably different.
It's Milwaukee-ese.
Yes. And it's so specific to Milwaukee, it seems like you said.
I think it's it was such a strong German and Polish area that those languages had an influence. You can hear they'll switch phrases like I went down the corner around instead of I went around the corner to the shop. It's not as common now, I don't think, but the older generations still had a lot of influence from the German and the Polish, I think both. There's also a hardness to some of the peoples. I don't know if it's not really clipped. It's just that they talk really hard, almost like they're from the East, but they don't have that Eastern accent really. It's just kind of I don't know, they kind of punch their words a little bit, I guess. That's what I'm thinking.
Like the flatness of the Midwest with the punchiness of the East.
Yeah.
Interesting. So how about what people think of the way that you speak? I have been told that I speak very precisely. I'm a little scatterbrained tonight, so that might not have come across, but I have been told especially by my students, that I speak English in a very kind of precise and articulated way. I have also been known to ramble.
Well, that's what I've been told, Katie, by people. And when I lived in Chicago, I just moved back from Chicago 2 years ago, and people told me, and they kind of made fun of me because they said I spoke so precisely. Well, I didn't think I spoke any different than anybody else, but I guess I spoke differently than they do in Chicago.
I think in Chicago they speak so quickly.
Maybe that was it. And they cut their words shorter. Maybe, I don't know, but
that could be.
Yeah, they have different ways of saying things there too.
Yeah, Chicago is its own kind of bubble too, it seems like.
Yes.
Yeah. I've also been told that I say sorry instead of sorry.
Yeah.
Just pops out that way sometimes. Don't know where that came from.
That feels a little bit more southern border. I had a college roommate that always said sorry, and she was from Sikeston, Missouri. So I associate that word with Missouri.
Yeah, that could be.
Now, I've been told, and this is where you put the inflection in your sentence, that I put it towards the end so that it kind of rises like a question at the end of what I say.
Oh yeah.
Now, I just tried very
Cool.
hard not to do that in that sentence.
It's a whole thing. It's called upspeak.
I know.
Yeah.
So cool.
They tried to beat it out of you in law school because it makes you sound apparently like you don't know, you're not confident what you're saying.
Yeah. It's upspeak is commonly associated with Valley speak and Californian English.
Interesting.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I did grow up in the 80s, so there you go.
One of the things that I noticed about myself, we moved around a lot as I was growing up, and we lived in Kansas for a while. We moved from Dubuque County, Iowa to Kansas, and there is a difference in the way people speak in Wichita, Kansas. And I swore I will not speak like these guys do. I will not. And by the time I came back to Iowa for a visit at Thanksgiving, people said, "You talk funny." Because you assimilate, you start to pattern, and you do it without realizing. So Evelyn, what's that called? What happens to you that you take on?
I think it is just a form of assimilation, like proximity will
Yeah.
influence. If you were young and you wanted to fit in,
I didn't.
that happens.
Yeah.
It
was
happens unconsciously too, I think, sometimes.
Mhm.
It was
Yeah.
awful. It was a nasal. I got rid of it though.
It's almost a social graces sort of thing that you just unconsciously start following the patterns that they do to maybe make them feel comfortable and don't even know you're doing it.
That could be.
Yeah, we do
My-
like try to mirror other people when we're talking to them. I can see how that would become contagious very quickly.
My parents, when I was in my last year of college, moved from Milwaukee to South Texas. And by the time I saw my parents again, my mother especially tended to mirror, and she had the most awful accent by the time because it was a mixture of Milwaukeeese and Southern Wisconsin in general and South Texas. Her best friend was a native South Texan, and so she had a very, very Southern Texas accent. And my mom would start to assimilate all that. She never did get y'all down right, though. She always kept saying you all. And it was y'all.
It's a very useful word.
It is a very useful word. I think it's very, makes things a lot clearer when you're talking about everybody. And we just say you, whether it's a singular or plural, but if you say y'all, I mean, that means all of you.
Actually, all y'all is everybody.
That's
Y'all.
right. All y'all.
Yeah.
All y'all.
All y'all.
All y'all, yeah. And if you want pop down there, you ask for a Coke.
Yep.
No matter what you want. You want a Coke? Yeah, I want Dr. Pepper.
Yep. I had a good friend in my school days who moved up here from Mississippi, and that was a subject of much controversy at the lunch table. Never ending.
Right.
Yep. So how about our students now? How do you, or even others, like if they've made comments, perceive the way that your student speaks English?
As much as I went to affirm Verona and tell her to give herself a break, I also wanted to help her because she would come in every week with just feeling so frustrated with somebody that was at the shelter that made fun of her because her consonants are so precise, other than the R's. And the person would just mock her. They would talk back with her, repeat what she said. And that was just driving her crazy. And I wanted to go slap that person at the shelter.
Yeah, that's really frustrating.
Eric insists that I correct him. And it's really difficult for me to do because we have great conversations. So I'll try to make notes, and then later I'll say, you know, when we were talking earlier, you said this or that. And then I'll tell him, because I really hate to interrupt our conversations to
Yeah.
tell him, but he is so serious about me correcting his English because it's important to him that he speaks exactly the way he should, even though I know that we're taught as tutors that the way he brings his idioms into English shouldn't, you know, should be allowed to stand. So and I've talked to him about that, but he really wants his English to be perfect. So, you know, the customer's always right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That applies to tutoring too.
That's
I
right.
like your strategy though, to like let the conversation play out and then come back to it and not be interrupting in the middle, because it's understandable that he's holding himself to that like very precise standard based on, you know, he wants to go to law school, he wants to pass the bar. But yeah, you also want to be able to communicate with each other and let his words flow naturally
Right.
to express himself. Yeah.
When I was tutoring Zainab, she worked at Red Lobster in the kitchen. And so we would always start every week with, she would have wrote down things that like her coworkers had said to her that she wasn't sure what it meant, and that she would want me to explain to it so that she could you know, be able to respond and have communication with her coworkers. And so some of it would be like, she'd be like, you know, people just, you know, asking what you did over the weekend, or, or stuff. And so, yeah, I thought that was nice, because that was one of what I wanted for her was, you know, to be able to develop relationships with her English, with people at work, and have conversations. And sometimes that's not speaking formal English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Because the one she would always ask me was, she was like, what does "what's up" mean? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, that's a common one. Gonna is another exciting
Yep.
one. Whenever we talk about gonna, people are like, I've been hearing this word everywhere. Yep. Yeah. I really enjoy just like hearing the way that people talk around gaps in their vocabulary. I think like sometimes results in communication being more like complicated in a way, but it can also be very very expressive just to hear like the words that people choose to describe something. I always think that's interesting. I had some students who were like a very, very beginning level of English, a group that I was teaching, and they would say, they would repeat words to emphasize them instead of like adding on adjectives or adverbs. Like instead of saying, you know, I was walking all day, they would say like yesterday, walking, so tired, walking. And it, you know, with only a few words, they were able to communicate a lot to me. So have you had any conversations with your students on this subject about the many Englishes that there are in the world?
Yeah, I think that's a given when you're working with him. You say, well, this is the way we pronounce it here, or I specifically pronounce it here. But that was part of my undergirding with Rana was, but if you go to another part of the country, it might be a little bit different. So that's why people need to be more accepting of you being a little bit, different, because it's different all over.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I have had some students who have like moved around and lived in different states in the country and would, ask me about differences that they noticed, y'all being the big one. Like, why don't people say y'all here? I got used to that before and people don't know people don't know that word here. Yeah, this is always an interesting one to bring up with people too, even if they might not have picked up on it yet. I know when you're just starting out in a language, it can be hard to even notice different versions of that language, but definitely a good thing for you to think about as a teacher and to just point out whenever it does come up. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about some specific teaching implications now. So the big one, always, which we've really been driving home tonight, is that there are many correct ways to speak English. And we just want to make sure that students are aware of that and to be, just constantly reinforcing that with them. So if they express any like biases towards the way that they themselves speak English or about the way that they've heard other people speaking English, please challenge them on that. There are some just realities like we've talked about that some of our students might face discrimination based on the way they speak, and that's not necessarily something that we can change at the drop of a hat as much as we wish we would. But we can at least kind of provide some affirmation for our students that they are speaking correctly, and that the way that others might judge them doesn't reflect on their true kind of value as English speakers. And for that matter, as you're out in the world, definitely try to dispel myths if you do hear any of those coming up, and just, helping to create that world that will be more accepting of all different kinds of English. So another thing to do is to teach your student how people really speak. So obviously we have our lovely textbooks and our wonderful teaching materials, but as always, those are a tool. They're not a sacred text that we must stick to at all costs. So use them as a tool, use them to demonstrate the way that we use the English language. But if you're encountering something in the textbook that doesn't necessarily reflect everyday English, then feel free to, and please do, let your student know how people might actually say this. Another thing here too is just like registers of English. We can talk about like, when you're with your friends, you might speak a certain way versus if you're going to the DMV and trying to get a driver's license, you might use a different form of English. So that's always good to kind of talk about as well. And this is a little bit harder when it's just you and your student talking with each other, but it is good to expose them to many different Englishes. So if you can bring in, like, videos are always great. I oftentimes will use videos just to practice, different listening activities with my student, and sometimes I'll throw in ones that are in a different variety of English just to keep them on their toes a little bit, because we do not all only speak with other Midland speakers of English. We're going to be encountering a lot of different kinds of English in our daily lives, and yeah, we just want to make sure our students are prepared for that too. So do any of you have questions, or did this kind of spark any teaching tips that you would like to share?
No, those are all.
Good.
My students and I have been working through reductions, dropping letters. Kind of gonna is not quite a reduction, but instead of saying Judy and Jim are going to the store, it's Judy and Jim are going to the store.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm having her listen very carefully. I said, here's how people really talk. Judy and Jim are going to the store.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good example. Yep. I always say too with the textbook grammar, especially, that grammars, look at me go. Speaking of grammar is made up of patterns, not rules. It's mainly meant to describe the way that we actually speak. So you can always take those grammar rules and say, they're more like guidelines, they're patterns. Sometimes we break them.
More of an observational list that somebody made a long time ago rather than something that you have to do.
Yes. Yep. Definitely. Great. Well, you have all been a wonderful group tonight. Thank you so much for sharing about your students and about yourselves. It was fun to hear about all of your own sociolects and idiolects and personal use of English, and as always, to hear about your students as well. So thank you all for coming. We will be sharing this recording out with all the tutors too, so if you ever want to come back to it or share it with somebody else, you're welcome to do that. So
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll see you at the next one. Thanks, everybody.